A judge sentenced the child to 12 years in prison for killing his newborn sister, but what surfaced afterward changed everything. Alex sat on the hard wooden bench, not realizing how he had ended up here. He was only 12, but this room, filled with adults, did not seem childish at all. The judge, a tall man with a cold stare, flipped through papers before he spoke. Alex couldn't hear the whispers in the hall or the clatter of the court clerk's keys. Everything seemed blurry, as if in a fog. The defendant is found guilty, the judge's voice cut through that fog like a knife. Alex flinched. You are sentenced to 12 years in prison for the murder of your little sister, Lily Johnson. The judge paused, looking at the boy. Let this be a lesson that another person's life is more valuable than your anger or jealousy. Those words caused a whisper in the hall. Some shook their heads, some whispered to a neighbor, but two people stood out the most in this chaos. Emma, Alex's mother, sat in the front row, keeping her eyes on her son. She looked like her world had collapsed, but she was still trying to make sense of it. Her hands were shaking and a look of despair froze on her face. Sitting next to her was Robert, Alex's father. His face expressed nothing, no anger, no compassion. It was the mask of a man who had already made his decision and was not going to back down. Alex didn't say anything. He didn't understand what he should do. Guilty? But he didn't remember doing anything. That day was like a mosaic, broken into 1,000 pieces. He remembered Lily screaming. He remembered trying to calm her down. And then, the emptiness. In the prison car that was taking him to the correctional facility, Alex stared out the window, trying to realize what had just happened. The city behind the glass flashed like a movie. Everything seemed unreal. Did I kill Lily? His own voice echoed in his head. He wanted to turn to the driver and yell, "Stop. This is a mistake." But the words stuck in his throat. Alex didn't know how to prove he hadn't done it when he didn't even remember what had happened. Emma sat in the kitchen, staring into a cup of tea. The drink had long since gone cold, but she still hadn't taken a sip. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet without Lily's screams or Alex's footsteps. She thought back to how it had started. With Lily's birth, their family should have been happier, stronger, but instead the tension grew every day. Robert had always been strict. He loved order and demanded discipline, especially from Alex. "You have to be a man," he used to say. "Men don't complain, they solve problems." Alex did his best. He studied well, helped around the house, never argued with his father. But even that wasn't enough for Robert. When Emma found out she was pregnant again, she was happy. She thought Lily would bring new meaning, new joy to the family. But the pregnancy was difficult. Constant fatigue, anxiety, headaches. Robert, as usual, showed no sympathy. "It's only temporary," he'd say when Emma complained. "You'll get over it." Emma tried to cope, but after Lily was born, it became even harder. The baby cried almost every night, Alex looked increasingly depressed, and Robert spent more time at work than at home. "Why do you keep loading Alex up all the time?" she asked her husband one day as he made his son babysit Lily. "He's the big brother," Robert replied coldly. It's time he realized that family is a responsibility. Emma didn't argue, but inside she sensed something was wrong. Alex was becoming more and more withdrawn. He loved Lily, but sometimes her crying made him irritated. At such moments he felt guilty. How could he be angry with such a small and helpless child? He tried to help his mother, but his father's pressure made his life unbearable. Robert always found a reason to pick on her. You're rocking her too slowly in the chair, you forgot to change her diaper, you're just not trying, Alex. One night when Lily was crying again, Alex whispered, "Please stop talking." He immediately felt ashamed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that no one understood how hard it was for him. Emma noticed the change in her son, but didn't know how to help him. She was too busy with the infant and her own fears. Maybe he needs more time to himself. She tried to talk to Robert one day. Time to himself? He's a child. He doesn't need any indulgences, Robert retorted. Emma gave in. That day began as usual. Emma collected Alex from school, fed Lily, and asked her son to watch her while she went shopping. "Alex, can you manage?" she asked. "Yes, Mom," he replied quietly. She left, and when she returned, the house was already thrown into chaos. Emma closed the door behind her, leaving Alex with Lily. In recent weeks, she'd been asking him more and more often to look after her little sister. Lily was a restless child. Once she started crying, it was almost impossible to stop her. Alex, though he tried, didn't always manage. "I'll be back in an hour," she said before walking out. Alex stayed in the living room, sitting on the floor and leafing through a textbook while Lily lay in her crib. For the first few minutes everything was quiet. Lily only occasionally whimpered quietly, and Alex already thought that everything would go without any problems. But soon the silence changed to loud, tearing cries. Alex put aside his textbook and walked over to the cradle. "Lily, please stop crying," he murmured, trying to calm her down. He picked her up in his arms and started rocking her like her mother had taught her. But nothing worked. The crying became louder and louder, as if echoing in his head. Alex felt a strange irritation rising in his chest. "Quiet, please," he said louder, but Lily didn't stop. The crying was becoming unbearable. Alex began to panic. "Why won't you calm down?" he blurted out. Suddenly his hands froze. For a moment he felt a strange numbness, as if everything around him ceased to exist. He didn't even notice his own breathing quicken and his heart beat so hard it hurt. When Emma returned, the house was eerily quiet. "Alex?" she called out, but no one answered. She walked into the living room and saw her son sitting on the floor next to the crib. Lily lay in the cradle, motionless. "Alex!" Emma shouted, rushing to her daughter. But Lily wasn't breathing. Her face was pale, her small hands lying listlessly at her sides. "Alex, what's wrong?" She grabbed her son by the shoulders, shaking him, but he only remained silent. His eyes were wide open and his face expressed complete incomprehension. I don't know," he mumbled, as if he didn't realize what had happened himself. Emma called the police. The entire house filled with chaos. Medics, police officers, investigators, everyone was trying to figure out what had happened. Robert came home a few hours later. Upon hearing the news, he looked at Alex as if he had already passed judgment on him. "What did you do, Alex?" His voice was cold, without an ounce of sympathy. I didn't do anything," the boy mumbled. But no one believed him. A few days later, the inquest concluded, the cause of Lily's death was strangulation. And no one but Alex had been home at the time of her death. Emma couldn't believe it. She knew her son. Alex had loved Lily, had always tried to take care of her. But her attempts to convince the police and the investigation had gotten her nowhere. "We see it every day," one investigator said. "Older children sometimes can't handle responsibility. An infant crying can trigger a rage attack." "No, it's not about Alex," Emma said confidently, but her words sounded too quiet amid the accusations. At the trial, the prosecutor built a case around jealousy. The boy was jealous of his sister, feeling unloved. "It's a classic case," the prosecutor said, pointing at Alex. Robert supported that version. Emma, on the other hand, sat next to him, looking at her son, who seemed lost. As the judge read out the sentence, Emma felt as if her heart would burst. The defendant is sentenced to 12 years in prison for the murder of his younger sister. Alex lifted his head and looked at his mother. "Mom, I didn't do it," he whispered. But his words were drowned in the silence of the hall. The trial didn't last long. Everything seemed very clear. The child was alone at home with the infant was dead, it was the child's fault. The prosecutor, a tall man with a loud voice, looked like he was sure of his victory before the trial even began. "Dear court, we have every reason to believe that Alex Johnson, driven by jealousy and anger, intentionally strangled his little sister Lily," he began, as if reciting a pre-learned text. Emma sat in the hall as if glued to a chair. Her hands were clutching the hem of her dress, and she could barely breathe. Next to her, in complete silence, sat Robert. Alex was a withdrawn child, and it's not uncommon for older children in families where an infant comes along, the prosecutor continued. He felt neglected, unwanted. His actions are tragic, but not uncommon. Emma looked at Alex, who was sitting in the dock. His face was pale, his eyes downcast. She knew he couldn't have done it. But the prosecutor's words, which sounded like a sentence, made her doubt even herself. When Alex's attorney took the floor, his voice was soft, almost apologetic. "My client is a 12-year-old child," he began. "He loved his sister as much as any older brother. Yes, he was alone in the house at the time of the tragedy, but that does not mean he is guilty. We ask the court to take into consideration my client's age and the lack of direct evidence of his guilt." However, the lawyer's words sounded weaker and more unconvincing than the prosecutor's denunciations. The key moment was Robert's presentation. "My son has always been troubled," he began, his voice sounding cold and detached. "He's withdrawn, he often has angry outbursts. I tried to teach him discipline, but apparently it wasn't enough." Emma wanted to scream. "How can you say that about your son?" These words swirled around in her head, but she remained silent, paralyzed by fear. Robert continued, "I can't justify his actions, but I'm not surprised it ended this way. It's a tragedy, but he must be held accountable." Those words sounded like the final nail in the lid of the case. Emma felt the ground go from under her feet. As the judge began to read the verdict, silence hung in the room. "Alex Johnson, the court finds you guilty of the murder of your sister and sentences you to 12 years in a juvenile detention facility." Alex raised his eyes, looking at his mother. "Mom, I didn't do it," he whispered. But his words sounded too quiet for anyone to hear them. Emma felt her heart being torn apart. Robert sat motionless, as if everything that was happening was just an inevitable formality to him. Alex was led away and Emma remained seated, feeling the world crumble around her. Alex sat on a narrow bed in his new room, a small cell with bare concrete walls. Behind the bars, he could hear the warden's footsteps, and occasionally the screams of other prisoners, but otherwise the place was frighteningly quiet. He couldn't believe this was his home now. Everything that had happened in the last few days seemed like a terrible dream from which he could not wake up. For the first few days Alex practically didn't speak. He sat in the corner of the dining hall, not touching his food, trying not to meet the other guy's eyes. Despite the fact that most of them were his age, their faces, their mannerisms seemed to him adult, stiff, even frightening. "Hey, new kid," someone addressed him one day. Alex raised his head. In front of him stood a sturdy boy of about 15 with a cold stare. "What are you doing here, huh?" Alex was silent, not knowing what to answer. "Tell me what you did," the boy continued, leaning closer. "I didn't do anything," Alex mumbled. The guy grinned. "That's what everyone says. But you don't just get in here." "So what? Stole anything? Got in a fight? Come on." Alex lowered his head. It wasn't my fault," he whispered. The guy snickered, but didn't bother Alex again. At that moment, however, Alex realized that no one here was interested in the truth. The days stretched like an eternity. Alex tried to remember what had happened that day, but the memories were like a broken mirror. He saw only separate pieces that didn't add up to a whole picture. He remembered Lily crying. He remembered trying to comfort her. Remembered closing his eyes, and then, silence. "I couldn't have done it," he kept telling himself. But the more he tried to convince himself, the more doubts arose. One night Alex woke up from a dream he had. In this dream, he was home again. Lily was crying and he was standing in front of her crib. Suddenly he felt someone's presence behind him. He turned around, but there was no one. Waking up, Alex could hardly breathe. It was hard for him to distinguish between dream and reality, and it scared him the most. Meanwhile, on the loose, Emma was trying to cope with her grief. She felt completely broken. She had lost her daughter, she had lost her son. She hardly spoke to Robert, who seemed to have closed the page long ago. "You've got to get over it," he'd once said at dinner. "Reconcile?" Emma looked up at him. "With my son being accused of something he didn't do? How can you say that?" "Because I see reality," he replied without taking his eyes off his plate. Emma stood up from the table. "If that's what you think, then I don't want to talk to you." She retired to her bedroom and closed the door behind her, leaving Robert alone. Several months passed, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Alex had been wrongly accused. She began reviewing the court records, rereading the testimony. Her mind clung to the slightest inconsistencies. "Something's not right here," she said to herself one evening. Emma felt compelled to get to the truth, even if it meant going against her own husband. Emma sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and photographs. Court records, police reports, articles from the internet all formed a chaotic pattern that she tried to piece together into a logical picture. Each document contained details that seemed important to her, but as soon as she began to delve deeper, the answers slipped away, leaving even more questions. Her thoughts went back to that day again and again. Lily, Alex, the silence. Something about that silence was unnatural. Robert walked into the kitchen and stopped when he saw this chaos. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice dry, almost irritated. "I want to understand what happened," Emma replied without taking her eyes off the papers. "Emma, we already know everything." Alex was there. No one else was. "It's a tragedy, but, stop looking for something that isn't there." "You don't understand," she said, raising her gaze to him. "I'm a mother. And I know my son. Alex couldn't have done this." Robert sighed heavily. "You don't want to admit the truth. It's only making things worse. We've already lost our daughter, do you want to lose yourself as well?" Emma didn't answer anything. She knew that arguing with him was pointless. Later that night, when Robert had gone to bed, Emma opened the papers again. She found the records of Alex's first interrogations. "I didn't do anything. I just wanted her to stop crying. I held her in my arms, and then. I don't remember." Those words seemed strange to her. Why couldn't he remember? Why were the memories being cut short? Emma started going through other documents. She found a small detail in the medical report that made her stop. The time of Lily's death was listed as approximately 14:30. She glanced at her notes. At 2:15 p.m., Alex had called her phone. He said Lily was crying and asked when she would be back. How could he commit a crime after only a few minutes? She thought. The next day, Emma decided to talk to a neighbor who had seen their family on the day of the tragedy. It was Mrs. Hendricks, an elderly woman who always noticed everything that was going on in the neighborhood. "Did you notice anything strange that day?" Emma asked, sitting in her kitchen. Mrs. Hendricks hesitated for a moment. "Well, I remember that Robert came home earlier than usual," she said finally. Emma tensed. "Robert? He was home before the tragedy?" "Yes," the woman nodded. "I saw his car for about 2 hours. Then he drove away, but I thought it was strange, he's usually late for work, after all." Emma felt everything inside freeze. Why didn't he ever talk about it? She whispered. When Emma got home, Robert was sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee. "Are you hiding something from me?" she asked bluntly, her voice firm. He looked up at her. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Hendricks said you were home that day before it happened with Lily. Why didn't you tell me?" Robert paused, but his face remained calm. "I stopped home for lunch. It doesn't change anything." "Why didn't you say anything about it at the trial?" "Because it doesn't matter," he retorted. "Are you sure?" Her voice trembled. "Emma, that's enough. Are you trying to accuse me?" "I just want to know the truth," she said. That night, Emma didn't sleep again. She realized that Robert was hiding something and decided she had to get to the truth. Emma couldn't stop herself. What Mrs. Hendricks had said couldn't get out of her head. Robert had been home that day, but he'd hidden it. Why? She had to know the truth. Her hands shook as she opened her laptop. She began searching for everything she could find about the time periods mentioned in the police reports. She reviewed the calls and texts from Alex's phone, looked at the surveillance tapes from her neighbors. It was then that she came across footage from one of the cameras installed across the street from their house. Emma froze when she saw it. Robert's car had indeed pulled up to the house at 1:55 p.m. and left at about 2:20 p.m. Why didn't he say anything? She whispered to herself. The next morning, Emma decided not to go back to Robert with the question directly. She went to see the detective who was in charge of their case. "I think there's a mistake in the file," she told the detective, holding out the camera footage to him. "A mistake?" he interjected, surprised by her visit. Robert was home that day before Lily died. He said it didn't happen, but here's the proof. Why didn't anyone check his alibi? The detective frowned, looking over the records. This could be important, he said, raising his eyes to Emma. You should reopen the case, she said, not hiding the desperation in her voice. A few days later, the detective contacted Emma. We checked the details you provided, he began. You were right. There are some things that don't add up. We've talked to Robert. Her heart sank. He didn't fight back for long. Admitted he was home when it all happened. But there's something else. What? Her voice shook. We found traces of the substance used to clean his car on Lily's clothes. That explains why he left in a hurry. We believe the death was an accident, but he tried to cover up his involvement so he wouldn't be blamed. Emma felt the air rush out of her lungs. He knew he did it, but he let Alex be blamed? It would seem so, the detective replied. When Emma came home, Robert was sitting at the dining room table. He realized everything as soon as he saw her face. You know everything, he said, not trying to justify himself. How could you? Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was anger in it. This is your son, Robert. You ruined his life. It was an accident, he began, but Emma interrupted him. And instead of admitting it, you decided it was easier to make a child guilty? Robert remained silent, his face impassive, but regret flashed in his eyes. I thought he could handle it. I didn't know it would go this far. You knew, she said firmly. And you did. You destroyed our family. Robert was arrested the same day. Emma attended the retrial when Alex was acquitted. But it didn't feel like a victory. Alex sat next to his mother, his face blank. You're free, Alex, she said, hugging him. But he didn't respond. Alex returned home almost a year after his sentencing. The house was the same, but it was no longer home to him. Emma tried to reconnect with her son, but Alex remained withdrawn. Do you want to talk? She asked one day, sitting down next to him. No, he answered quietly. I know it's hard for you. But you're not alone, Alex. I'm here. He looked at her, and there were more questions than answers in his eyes. Why did he do it? He finally asked. Emma didn't know what to say. I think he was afraid. Afraid the truth would ruin his life. And my life? His voice shook. She was silent. The ending of this story was not a happy one. Emma and Alex were left alone, trying to find a new meaning in life. Their family was shattered and their trust was destroyed. Will Alex ever be the same again? Will he forgive his father? The answers to these questions remain unknown.